There we go. Okay, I wanted to start off just quickly. Let's take a look at these 3 protists that you were supposed to take a look at. Oh, were there any questions from the homework at all from yesterday? I'm fogging up here. Uh-oh. Any questions from the homework yesterday? Yes.
It wouldn't really add a photo into Canvas.
Is there no photo editing thing? Were you...
It's like, you have to upgrade it.
Really? Did you use the link, the like free, the upgrade link? And it's still, so it said like you have a free 90-day pro trial and it won't let you insert a photo?
You have to press the link twice, like to get in first time and then like close the tab and then click the link another time to upgrade it.
Ah, did you try that? Try that. Everyone should have the full version of Cami, so you should be able to use all the functions. If not, like, let's figure that out. Same thing for the people at home. If it's like not letting you put a photo in, I paid for it, so so I better be giving you the full experience. If not, let's chat about that. You're going to be using it also throughout the semester, so we should get that figured out if it's not working for you. Okay, so this right here is an amoeba. I thought it was really funny because I just wanted to Google amoeba to look it up. And most of the stuff that comes up is articles about brain-eating amoeba, which is a illness that is caused by an amoeba, which you can get from swimming in fresh water. If it goes like up your nose, the amoebas can get into your bloodstream and go past your blood-brain barrier and cause an infection in your brain. It's pretty rare, but it does happen occasionally, and especially happens if you swim in stagnant water. Not recommended. But it is possible. You're not supposed to like get a whole bunch of that water into your nose. But the thing that I thought was funny is when you look that up, most of the pictures that come up are not amoebas. So there's like a ton of news articles and they're like, brain-eating amoeba, picture, paramecium. There's like a whole bunch of them. So a lot of them are not amoebas that are in the pictures, which is, I guess nobody knows what an amoeba is. But this is an amoeba right here. So what are some key characteristics? By the way, did anybody, oh, let me pull this up. I actually put it on today's stuff, that's what it was. I threw in some, I wonder if you can see it through this, let's see. Diversity, save 4, right? Nothing to view. You can't view it through here? That's annoying. Still figuring this thing out. So it doesn't actually let you look at the content through that app? Well, that's kind of a bummer. That's not as functional as I was hoping. Okay, so here's the day 4 stuff. I put in a couple videos. This is just for people that are interested. You don't have to watch these. But the first one here is a compilation of protists fighting, all put to like some kind of weird jazz music. So if you're into that, they're actually pretty cool. There's a number of amoebas eating things or attempting to eat things. Amoebas have this really cool way of eating where they like envelop, they like kind of curve their body around the other protist or whatever it's eating, and then pull the other protist like inside of their body. And then they send all these little, it's very similar to actually the way that your white blood cells digest stuff. They bring stuff inside them, and then they use lysosomes. They send the lysosomes into that little vacuole that they create in the middle, that little vesicle, and then the vacuoles contain enzymes that break it down. So they basically like bring stuff inside of themselves and then digest it inside of themselves using these little vesicles full of digestive enzymes. So if you want to see what that looks like, there's a bunch of really cool videos here of amoebas eating things. And I wrote here that it's probably the nerdiest thing that you'll ever watch, but it is cool though. And I also threw up a video here of, I mentioned dog vomit slime mold yesterday, and this like pulsating fungi-like protist, where the individuals come together to form this superorganism. There's a really cool video of that if you're interested in seeing what it looks like. It's like this pulsating womp womp womp, and it just like creates these tendrils, and then the whole thing kind of moves along these little pulsating. I'll let you watch it on your own if you're interested. Anyway, it's really cool. But the reason I mentioned that is because that's one of the interesting and key characteristics of this amoeba right here, which is that it feeds. That's too big still. This isn't gonna work. I can barely read my own writing. I'll have to work on that. So that also means, by the way, that this is a heterotroph. I haven't been doing a lot of this, sorry. This is a heterotroph. What did I spell wrong? 2 R's. So it eats other things. What else is true about these protists? Oh, sorry, Mom. I didn't realize that was your school account. So then, okay, no worries then. You guys must have something else on your list. I bet you don't only have heterotroph. Really? Help me out here. You guys are supposed to lead this, not me. Go for it.
So I could say every guinea keeps gained within a cell membrane.
Okay. That's true for all protists, but sure.
I guess that
Why isn't it letting me click on this? There we go. I'm gonna add something extra on there that is highly flexible. It has a really interesting way of locomoting, of moving around. Oh, were you gonna mention? Let's go ahead.
Oh, yeah. It extends and retracts pseudopods.
So pseudopods is basically taking a piece of its body and worming it out. Keep in mind this is a single cell. So it's taking some of its membrane and like worming it out. And then it kind of pumps its entire body into the part that it wormed out. So it gets around by doing that, which is kind of cool. So that method of locomotion is called pseudopod locomotion. There are not a lot of organisms that do that. That's pretty unique to the amoeba. Any other characteristics? What kind of protist is this? Of the 3 kinds we talked about, plant-like, animal-like, or fungi-like, which one is this one? Based on its properties. Nobody even wants to volunteer this, really.
Fungi.
What's that?
Fungi-like.
Why do you think it's fungi-like?
Because it doesn't look like an animal, so it's autotroph.
Okay. Why does it not look like an animal to you? What's the features of an animal that it's lacking?
I don't know, like a mouth.
Okay, that's interesting. You're right. It does not have a mouth. So some of these other protists, like the paramecium, actually do have a mouth. So this thing doesn't have a mouth. You're right. When we went back and we talked about what makes something animal-like protist, was have a mouth one of the characteristics? No. So that's important to remember. And I actually totally get where you're coming from here. This does not look like an animal. I agree with you. What makes something an animal, though, according to that list? I can scroll up to it here too if you'd like. Here's our list.
Yeah, okay, so it's motile. What is motile? So,
It's motile and it's a heterotroph, right?
yeah.
And it eats things. So it fits into this definition. I completely get where you're coming from. It does not look like a traditional animal. That is absolutely true. This is one of the weirdest looking animal-like protists. Come on. There we go. So an animal-like protist is also called a protozoan. Oops, protozoan is what I meant, right? All right, Euglena. This is a weird one. And these are all weird, but what are some characteristics of these things? Hopefully you guys look these up. Yes. Okay. Flagellar movement. So you can see it at the back of the thing in that picture. It's like that little wispy guy right there is a little flagella. It has a motor protein on one end of it that spins it around. And so then when the flagella whips around, it creates like a little current behind it that propels it along. You guys didn't get to see these under the microscope, but they're very fast. So they zip around underneath the microscope. Like for their body size, it's unbelievable how fast they move. What else?
They're autotrophic and heterotrophic.
Ah, yes. So, this one is really weird. They are both. They have chloroplasts inside. So some of those little green guys in there are chloroplasts. You can actually see them if you look really closely. Some of them have thylakoids inside. You can see the little pancakes inside. Those are the thylakoids inside the chloroplast. So they do have chloroplasts, like plants have chloroplasts. They do photosynthesis, but they also have a mouth or a mouth-like fixture on them so they can consume food as well. Don't see that in the natural world a lot. Yes?
They have the ability to make their own food.
Right, so they're also autotrophs. Yep, absolutely. Anything else about them interesting? Those are pretty much the two really unique things about them. What kind of protist is it? This is a little bit more difficult because there's some hybridization going on here. This is plant-like, and the reason it's plant-like is because it does photosynthesis. Any of the ones that do photosynthesis we call plant-like protists, even if they move. So this is a plant-like protist. You might say, oh, that's not a very good way to categorize them. I agree. It's a terrible way to categorize them. That's why the protists are the one grouping taxonomically that like the grouping doesn't really make sense. So I don't think protist is going to remain as a kingdom probably for an extended period. Right now it's like a catch-all for like everything that doesn't fit in the other kingdoms, but it doesn't really make sense from a phylogenetic perspective, and so we're going to see more kingdoms coming. There's a kind of a big push in microbiology to make an adjustment here, but it's everything's slow in academia, so I don't know how long it'll be like this, but I don't think that this will be a kingdom for a super long time. All right, let's leave it there. That's pretty good. And then lastly, we've got these guys. Where's the little mouth on him? Oh, right here. It's kind of hard to see. That's it right there. It's got a little mouth. It's not actually called a mouth, but it is an opening where they can take food particles in. It's got some little hair-like projections on the side of it. Keep in mind, this is a single cell. So it's not like made of cells. It's like a cell mouth, which is really ridiculous. It's a lot larger than a typical animal cell, so it kind of makes a little bit more sense. If you were to look at like one of your skin cells, for example, next to this thing, your skin cell would be like that big. So like it's quite a bit bigger than like an average eukaryotic cell. But oops, what just happened? But yeah, it has a cool little cell mouth. It's really a shame that we didn't get to look at these under the microscope because they are cool. It's cool to watch them eat and stuff. Tell me some things. Okay, so these are only heterotrophs. They are predators. 1 year, people were not careful and they accidentally transferred a bunch of these into the other containers, the euglena and the amoeba containers, and then we said, oh, what happened to everything? And they ate them all. So the paramecium went around and ate all the other things. So they will eat the things if you leave them together. What else is true about them? How do they move?
With the hair projections, they're called cilia.
Yeah. So they look kind of like hairs. You can just barely see them on this photo. They're like wispy on the side, but they're right there. You can just sort of see them right here. These like little hairs sticking off the side. And they move them in like waves down the side of their body. And then it like propels them forward through the liquid. These guys are also really fast. So they just zip across your microscope slide. It's pretty amazing how quickly they can move considering how like tiny they are and they're single-celled. What else? We don't need to get into super detail here. I'll make sure that we note that they're protozoans too. I would really love to put a fungi-like protist into the mix when we do this lab, but they're basically just impossible to get. I cannot find a source for fungi-like protists. It would be really cool if we could. The other problem with them is that for most of their life cycle, they actually live as individuals. So you can't really get them in like a colony like you see in the video that I posted. They only do that for part of their life cycle. So, but they are super cool. Anyway, here we go. So there's 3 sample protists. You should have a basic knowledge of these. You should be able to identify these if you see them. They're fairly obvious differences here. Like if it's got a flagella, it's going to be a euglena. As far as what I'm going to show you, obviously there's many species we're not looking at here, but should be able to tell the difference between these 3. Any other questions before we keep going?
Is there like a scientific name for plant like how they're proposing for animals?
No. And part of the problem here is that under the plant-like ones, there's so much diversity that they just, these are like impromptu categories that we're just like, all right, let's try and figure something out here because there's so much diversity, but no, there isn't. Any other questions? Okay, let's talk about fungus. We're going to cover 3 things today, which seems like a lot. We're going to cover fungus, plants, and animals. Plants and animals, we're going to do a very, very brief overview of those things because we do an entire unit on plants and an entire unit on animals. So while animals, we're not really looking at the diversity in the animal unit, we're really looking at just like how certain organ systems function. In the plants unit, it really is like a very exhaustive look into plants. What are the structures of plants? What are the different kinds of plants? So I don't want to dig into that too much in this unit. You just need to know the very basics of those ones because we'll get to it later. But fungus we'll spend a little bit more time on. Let me just quickly show you what I've got for you today. So we're going to do this little lesson together. There is a quick summary video. There's some questions in the course notes, which we'll talk about, and then there's a couple analysis questions from your textbook. For the plants unit, we're going to do something very similar. And for the animal unit, we're going to do something very similar. So there's a little table in your textbook that we're going to do. During Learning Block 3, I just want to mention that today is kind of like the end of the content for this unit, for diversity unit. That's all we're going to cover in terms of diversity. So we talk generally about classification and phylogeny, and then in more detail about the kingdoms. And tomorrow, we're going to start a short project, a summative project that you're going to do for this unit. I'm still kind of working out exactly how you can present that project. I want to give you some choice, but I also don't want to make it too broad so that people don't know what they're doing. So I'll get back to you on that one. And tomorrow we're also going to write the unit quiz. It is a 32-mark quiz. It's mostly multiple choice, a little bit of true and false. One thing to mention about the quiz. Okay, sorry. Yeah, I mentioned the 2 practice quizzes for you to work on. You can probably do those during learning block 3. If you have extra time and you during one of the other learning blocks and you want to do the first quiz, just go for it. You can just have it open in the background. There's no time limits or anything. Just like there is no time limit, by the way, for the unit quiz tomorrow. Like, just take however long you want. Like, if you want to take 2 hours to go through it before you submit your answers, then fine. I don't really care. You have until midnight tomorrow to finish it. So if you're like at home and you, I don't know, have, for some reason can't do it during learning block 3, or you guys are, you know, going home on the bus or whatever, don't worry about it. Okay, just whenever you have time to do it tomorrow. It's not super essential. It is essential that you complete it, but this doesn't have to be done like promptly. Okay. And then the other part is that tomorrow we're going to work on our summative assignment, which I'll get more details for you. Okay. And other than that, the learning block 3 is going to be exactly the same as before. Keep in mind that your vocabulary list is due tomorrow at the end of the day as well. Hopefully you've been adding to it as you've been going, which would mean that really there's not that much extra for you to complete, but you're going to add in vocabulary from today as well. You need at least 30 words, I think, which is probably going to be no problem for you, I would assume, in this unit, because there's just a lot of new vocabulary. So anyway, just wanted to mention that quick. Let's get back to what we're talking about. Fungus. Yes, question. You guys can't see it. What is happening? Could we have more technical problems, please? Here we go. Why does it look like that? We had a good run. We had like a technical problem-free run there for like a while. Oh, disconnected. Okay. Okay. Ah, there we go. All right. Fungus. How do you know you're looking at a fungus? Well, under the microscope, they're eukaryotes, so they're going to have membrane-bound organelles when you look at their cells. But at a biochemical level, the main biochemical thing that's true for all fungi is that they have chitin in their cell walls. Okay, sorry guys. This thing has decided to stop working. Okay, there we go. So instead of having cellulose in their cell walls, which is what plants have, or having peptidoglycan in their cell walls, which is what bacteria have, fungus have chitin in their cell walls. It is a very tough molecule. And if you've ever eaten mushrooms, which you probably have, that like rubbery, like chewy texture that mushrooms have, that's from chitin. So it's actually a pretty, like I said, it's a pretty tough molecule. So it makes the fungal cells quite resilient. If you've ever like seen how hard like a bracket fungus is on a tree, like you could almost climb them. They're really solid. And that's because a really high concentration of chitin in their cell walls. So it makes it really hard. So that's the one thing that you're going to find in all of these cells. Most of them are multicellular. There are a few that are single-celled fungi, so they don't have to be multicellular. So like the prime example of single-celled would be, what do you make beer out of? Use it for making bread. Yeast, thank you. Yeasts are fungi, but they're single-celled fungi. They live in colonies, but they are definitely single-celled. And they all have a process of external digestion. So in the very, very early days of taxonomy, these are in like the in the original taxonomic system, plants and fungus were actually put together. I don't think people knew at that time what photosynthesis was, and they just assumed that fungus was just the same as a plant. It grows, it kind of looks like it has roots, I guess. But there's no photosynthesis going on here. So they're all heterotrophic, every single one of them. So they get their energy by growing into things, and then they release enzymes, digestive enzymes, out of their little tendrils called hyphae, and break down the material that they're sitting in, and then suck up the nutrients from their surroundings. Most. Yeasts don't do that. They just kind of sit on the surface of things and take in the nutrients from the surroundings, but most other fungi have some type of digestive process. They have pretty cool reproductive structures called mushrooms that produce spores. Most of them create mushrooms, although again, not all of them do. Yeast doesn't create mushrooms, but those are like the sexual organs of the fungus. It's how they mate with other fungi through their mushroom. But keep in mind, that's a really, really small part of a fungus. So if you are looking out in nature and you see a mushroom, that's only seeing like the flower, basically, the reproductive structure of the fungus. The actual body of the fungus is in whatever's underneath that, going through the earth or through a log or whatever it's sitting on top of. That's the main body of the fungus. There's a lot more fungus underneath that than there is in the sexual structure that's on top. And then they have a really interesting reproductive cycle, which we're going to talk about a little bit later. They can reproduce sexually, so they can find a partner fungus where their spores come together, or they can reproduce asexually, where a piece of them breaks off and just becomes a new fungus. Plants can do that as well. They have all kinds of relationships in nature. A ton of plant species have symbiotic relationships with soil fungus. So a soil fungus will give them some type of protein or other nutrients that are not typically found in the soil. And then the plant will usually give it something in return, some kind of symbiotic exchange between the plant and fungus. Those are very common in nature. And they also make up the majority of the decomposers, especially decomposers of plant matter. So before fungus evolved on Earth, when plants died, plants are quite a bit older than fungus, they just kind of stacked up. They didn't really break down. They took a super long time to break down. So if you go back 100 million years, before fungus had the ability to break down plant matter, there were fungi at that time, but they weren't breaking down cellulose. We used to get cool things like continent-wide wildfires, where you would get a huge fire because the entire continent was loaded down with dead plant matter that wasn't breaking down. So there'd just be like these huge areas of old plant matter, and then you just get this crazy fire caused by lightning or something like that, which is insane. We don't really have anything like that anymore, but anyway, I think that's kind of cool. And they also make up, they're also really important in that they can break down rock. So they can grow into rock and create soil. So they're important for something that we're going to talk about in a different unit called, I hate it when I forget what a word is. It's on the tip of my tongue. Oh, don't make me Google this. Oh, you ever have that? You can have like a piece of it. Ah! Oh, I'm so close. It's on the tip of my tongue. I gotta Google this. Oh, succession. I didn't have to Google it. I knew it was gonna come to me. Succession. Succession is a process of when you have no life living in an area, and then what are the first things that arrive, and then the second things that arrive, and like make it livable for other living things. That's called the process of succession, and fungus is really important for the process of succession, which we're going to talk about in the plant unit a little bit. Okay, so we used to put plants and fungus in the same kingdom, but there are some really important differences. You guys should know the key differences between them. So first of all, fungus is a heterotroph. It eats things. And plants are all autotrophs, every single one of them. So there's no heterotrophic plants. That's a little confusing because some plants do capture insects and things like that, like a pitcher plant or a Venus flytrap, but they don't capture them for energy. They only capture them for nitrogen. So when we're talking about trophs, we're talking about where the energy is coming from. Even a Venus flytrap is not really like eating the fly for energy. It is getting nitrogen from the fly, but not for energy. So the energy is always coming from photosynthesis in a plant, and in a fungus, it is always coming from eating something. Big difference because you can have lots of fungus growing underground in a cave or something like that, whereas you cannot get plants growing in those environments. No sun, no plant. Structurally, they're quite different in terms of their cell wall. We already mentioned this. So fungus have chitin and plants have cellulose. They have different reproductive strategies. Most fungi use sporulation, so they produce spores in order to reproduce, which is different from alternation of generations, which is what plants do. We'll get into that in more detail when we talk about plants. But essentially, plants have a male and a female. The male will make a different plant structure called pollen, and the female will make a different plant structure, which is an egg, basically. And then the male structure releases the pollen, and then the pollen finds its way to the egg via insect or wind or whatever. We'll get to that later. And then those two separate organisms come together and form a single new organism, which is the next generation of plant in the form of a seed. The seed germinates and then forms an adult, and then the process repeats itself. So that's alternation of generations, super basic version. Spores are identical, but they are a form of male and female. They don't usually say male and female for spores. Oftentimes they just say that they're plus or minus spores. The spores will land and form a fungus that is like a half fungus. This is if the fungus uses spore reproduction. Not all of them do, but the ones that do. So you've got a plus fungus growing and a minus fungus, but it only has half of the genetic information that it needs to make a full fungus. So on its own, it looks like a fungus, but it can't reproduce. It only has half of the DNA that it needs. And when it grows, when it comes into contact with, if a plus comes into contact with the minus, then they will exchange genetic information, and then where they meet, they will begin growing a full, real fungus, a mature fungus, which is definitely different from alternation of generations. So plants don't do that. So they have different reproductive strategies. Some fungi use respiration to make their energy. You guys know about cellular respiration, right? You guys have talked about this in grade 10, I'm assuming here. Use oxygen and some type of sugar, right? And you produce water and carbon dioxide. Does that sound familiar? Yeah. So some fungi use that, but then other fungi don't. They can use some anaerobic process to make their energy. Good example would be yeast. So yeast do fermentation instead of regular oxidative metabolism, which we can obviously capitalize on. We use it to make alcohol, make beer or wine or whatever you're producing, or rubbing alcohol. So this rubbing alcohol was produced with fungus too, so you can use it for all kinds of stuff. Whereas plants, they all just use regular oxidative metabolism to produce ATP with their mitochondria, just like most other eukaryotes. Just as a heads up, the chat is working again, so if you have any questions, you can put them into the chat. I didn't get all your spam messages though, so if anything important was you typed during that period, you're going to need to write that again. Okay, let's talk about their structure. So, when we're talking about basic fungal structures here, the one that you're familiar with probably is the mushroom. Again, that's the flower of the fungus. That is arguably the least important part of the fungus. The main body of the fungus, and by the way, this diagram is not to scale because the mycelium, which is that structure that's below the surface, is usually much, much larger than the mushroom. It's got to draw its energy from a huge area underneath in order to produce that big reproductive structure. So it's usually quite large. If you, for example, see fungus growing on cheese or on a piece of bread or something like that in your fridge, what you're seeing on top of the bread are the mushrooms, the spore-producing part of the fungus. And the actual fungus itself, like the mycelium component, is growing underneath into the thing. And it's very difficult to see. So it might be penetrating, 2 centimeters into your cheese or 5 centimeters into your bread. It goes probably considerably deeper than what you can see. Oftentimes they're transparent, so you can't actually see the mycelium growing down into your food, but it's under there. So I love it when people just like cut off a little bit off the top and they're like, oh, I got the fungus up there. You didn't really get it all off there, but that's okay. Most of them are harmless to eat anyway, but still, you probably didn't cut it off. Anyway, so that main body of the fungus is called the mycelium. And the mycelium is made out of this branched structure that is one cell thick, and it branches and branches and branches and curves all over the place. And that is the main body of the fungus. The cool thing about it is that if you look at the structure of those hyphae, they're called hyphae, the single-celled with strings, whatever you want to call them, those are called hyphae. The hyphae are not separate cells. They have compartments. So if you look at them under the microscope, you'll see like the end of one and the beginning of another one. But there are these really big pores in between the cells. And oftentimes the cells will have more than one nucleus in them. So the cytoplasm is actually continuous all the way through the mycelium, which is very unusual for a multi-celled organism. So these aren't really like true cells per se, because they're really not separate from their neighbors. It really makes sense structurally though, because the fungus does not have a circulatory system. So if way down on this end of the fungus here is like, oh, I just found some delicious apple or like whatever, okay? It like grows into something that's like, oh, so nutrient dense. And then it's like importing all this delicious nutrient into this cell. Well, the rest of the fungus doesn't have access to it, right? There's no like blood vessels carrying sugars and things from that thing that it's eating to the other parts of the fungus. So just purely by diffusion, if you get a really high sugar concentration over in this area, it's just going to naturally diffuse because there's just like a giant hole going between the cells. It just diffuses through the fungus. So you end up getting this energy transfer that goes through the entire fungus. It doesn't work great. Obviously, it's not as fast as a circulatory system, but it is functional. So it's a very low energy way of transporting goods around your organisms that you just basically have one giant cell with kind of like little connectors in between. Anyway, so it's continuous from end to end. I'd like to say that this, we're going to talk about like a style of life cycle here. I'd like to say that that applies to most fungi, but they really are quite diverse. So there is no like most do this. We hit the main points here that they all share, which is that they all have chitin in their cell walls. We wrote them up here. They're all heterotrophs. And that's about it. Other than that, it's a pretty diverse group. You guys ever heard of a fairy ring before? Ever seen one in the forest? I'll show you a picture. There's a real cool one. So if you ever go like out into a forest and you're like, oh cool, there's just like a circle. Circle of mushrooms. That is one organism that you're seeing right there. So this is really indicative of how the life cycle of a lot of fungi work, which is that some spores landed in the center here. They grew together, a positive and a minus, and formed one single fungus from the plus and minus. Okay, they put their nuclei together and they got a 2N fungus, one with the full genetic complement, all of the chromosomes that they need. And then the mycelium starts to grow out from that spot in every direction. And what happens is once they take on enough nutrients and the mycelium gets large enough, then they're like, okay, we have enough energy here to start building reproductive structures, mushrooms. But it builds them at the periphery of where it just grew its mycelium. So even though they met in the middle, that's where the beginning of the mycelium started to grow, the periphery is where they start to grow their mushrooms up. So this is actually one single organism here growing a bunch of reproductive structures around the ring, which is kind of cool. So if you ever see this in the forest, that's like one giant fungus that's growing a whole bunch of mushrooms. It's called a fairy ring. People used to think they were magical. I guess they are kind of magical. Anyway, here's the reproductive strategy here, just in brief again. You have, let's start the mushroom since that's the most familiar for people, okay? So a fungus produces a reproductive structure, a mushroom, which has gills usually on the underside of it. We used to do a dissection of a mushroom, but we're not gonna do that. If you want to at home, next time you eat a mushroom, just take the mushroom out and put a piece of paper underneath and just tap the mushroom on the piece of paper. You'll get this like brown fuzz that like falls out onto the piece of paper. Those are the spores from the fungus. They're quite small, so under the microscope they don't really look like much because they're extremely tiny reproductive structures. I think they might be even smaller than pollen. They're very small. They're usually carried by the wind, which is why they have to be so small. They have to be carried by air currents. But they produce those 1N spores. Okay, 1N. Oh, that's its 2N. Wait, I think we've jumped ahead here. So, oh, sorry. This is the production of spores. So, we haven't done meiosis yet, have we? So, you have 46 chromosomes, right? You guys know this? We'll talk about it more in genetics, but you have 46 chromosomes. That's called the 2N number for you, for humans. 2N means the full complement of chromosomes. It's what you need as a mature organism to have all of your DNA that you need to be alive, okay? The 1N number for an organism is half of that. When a 2N organism wants to make babies, they have to produce 1N parts because you produce a 1N half and your partner, whoever you'd be making a baby with, would also produce a 1N part, okay? And then when those two 1Ns come together, they will create a 2N, which would be a new mature organism, all right? That's the basics. We'll get into this more in genetics. Other organisms that reproduce sexually, they also have to produce a 1N component, okay? Something that's half of their genetics. So when we're talking about genetics, 2N is all of your chromosomes, all the DNA, and 1N is half. That's all you need to know for now. So parts of the fungus are 2N, they're a mature organism, and then through a process, you don't need to know the details of this, by the way, just the very basics of this, they're going to produce spores that are 1N. Okay, half of the genetic complement. And in fungus, they have this weird system where the 1Ns are either plus 1Ns or minus 1Ns. And I would call them male and female, but the reason that they don't use that terminology is because they're, for all intents and purposes, identical. So male and female is usually used to denote differences between the two. But in this case, they are structurally identical to each other. They look exactly the same. So it's just a plus and a minus. They fly out and land, and they create hyphae. They start building this fungus, but only half of the genetic complement is there. So they don't have all the information to form a regular, complete fungus. They definitely can't reproduce like this until you get a meeting, a chance meeting of hyphae out on a log somewhere. It's love at first sight, and where they connect, they're going to form a 2N organism right there. You're going to get a fusion of these two nuclei, and all of a sudden, you start communicating that genetic information. From that point, you start getting mitosis occurring and then a building of a 2N fungus. And then that's a complete organism. Starts building and growing the hyphae until you've got enough hyphae and mycelium that you can start growing a reproductive structure, and then the cycle starts over again. Okay, so that's spore reproduction. Here's a little summary of that over here. Another way of saying 1N, half the genetic complement, is haploid. Haploid means half of the DNA of a full organism. I don't really like the word dikaryotic. I'm actually going to cross this out. I don't think you'll ever see that word again in this course. Let's use a different word for this and call this diploid. So if haploid is half of the genetic complement, diploid means the full genetic complement, all of the chromosomes that you need for a full organism. And the actual number of chromosomes that make something haploid or diploid is dependent on the organism. You have 46, chimps have 48 as their diploid number. Fruit flies have 16, I believe. Depends on the organism. Some plants have 100. It's almost random. So like I said, you don't need to know this process in super detail, but the basics of it. Spores are created that have half the genetic complement. They land, they grow, they touch each other. And where they touch, as long as you get a plus and a minus, you get a diploid full organism growing there. Are we okay? Thank you. Okay, cool. Okay, so this part I'm going to get you to do on your own in a second here. We mentioned this, that some of these guys use fermentation in order to make energy. Yeast is one of the big ones that does fermentation from sugar. And just for this part, what I'd like you to do is just find out, through research, it'll take a couple seconds here, what is the basic process? How do we take advantage of that in order to produce whatever? It's not only we don't only use it to produce beer and wine, by the way. So there's other fermentation processes that we use for preservation and all kinds of things. How does that work? So what are the basics of how you use fermentation? Like, how does that work in terms of growing stuff? Okay, you can probably find a cool YouTube video to watch on that, I would assume too. You know, how to make beer or something like that. Cool. What is this other part here? Wild mushrooms. Oh yeah. Instead of doing this here, I'm going to save you some time. Let's talk about some cool mushrooms that are extremely dangerous. I used to have you do this as research, but I don't want to give you too much stuff to do here. We've got a lot already. A number of fungi produce really toxic things, probably to keep animals from eating them. One really cool example of that is the death cap. I should put a picture in here too so you can see it. Doesn't look like much. That looks like something that you just like see in a forest here. I don't think it grows here.
Forbidden fruit.
What's that?
Forbidden fruit.
Forbidden fruit. Yeah, exactly. One of the big issues with people poisoning themselves with fungus is that a lot of them look similar, and some species, for example, that grow in Europe, that are totally innocuous, like you could just go and eat them, but there are species that look exactly the same here, but are highly poisonous. So when people first came over from Europe here, when there's a lot of European immigration, people used to die all the time because they would go out and collect mushrooms and say, oh, this is just such and such mushroom that we always used to collect in the old country. And then you would die just from because they're obviously different species. Death cap, pretty dangerous. Small amounts cause pain, vomiting, death, often coma before death. It's an extremely powerful diuretic. Makes you pee. Looks pretty innocuous. We don't do a lot of self-mushroom collecting anymore. I feel like that's gone out of style. You still do it? Oh, so some people do it. Some people do it. If you know which species are safe to eat, well, you can still do it. I worked at a restaurant when I was a kid, and they used to go the chef used to go mushroom picking to get mushrooms for the restaurant. So obviously you knew what he was doing, but I wouldn't go picking them if you don't know what you're looking for. I should look up this destroying angel too. That's just a cool name for a mushroom. I'm hoping this one will look a little cooler. Come on, give me a good one. What does destroying angel look like? Underwhelmed. I'm underwhelmed. I was hoping for some bright colors. No wonder people are dying from these. That looks like you could just eat it. Don't do it. This one causes delirium and convulsions and kidney failure. And then other things like truffles are delicious. If you've ever had a truffle before, I should get a picture of that one too. Doesn't really look very good. I'm not sure I would find that in the woods and be like, oh yeah, definitely gonna eat this. They're a little on the expensive side. $3,100 a pound. It's out of my price range, but if you're a high roller, you can have some real truffles. They're supposed to be very tasty.
Mr. Wiggum,
Yes.
is there a possibility to farm fungus? Like, could you grow it as a crop? kind of.
Absolutely, and people do that. Yep, for sure. Like button mushrooms and things like that, people grow them as a crop. Yep. Yeah, you just need like a nutrient-rich like bed to grow them on. They use like manure or whatever to grow them, and then you can just scatter the spores. I think they have to be kept in the dark though. They grow a lot better without access to light. Plus, it prevents weeds. So the fungus can grow on that medium, and then if you keep them in the dark, you don't end up getting weeds and stuff growing because they all need light to grow with them. So I can probably find a picture of it. Let's see. Like a button mushroom farm. Let's see what it looks like. You absolutely can grow these. I don't know about truffles. I wonder if they can be grown as well. My guess would be that they're difficult to grow. They're extremely expensive. I feel like someone would have caught on to that if they were fairly easy to grow. There we go. So here's a facility growing button mushrooms. So I would say most of the time that's probably in complete darkness. I would assume they keep that window closed. So. But anyway, functional. There are a number of pathogenic fungi. Maybe you've had athlete's foot before. Athlete's foot is a fungus growing on your feet. I could Google this if you want to see what it looks like, but it's kind of gross. So I'll let you imagine. It's like a yellowish fungus that grows around your toenails and on your feet. It's very itchy. And you can use a fungicide to get rid of it, by the way. You don't have to live with fungus on your feet. But there are a number of pathogenic fungus. So that's one example. Mucor is an example of a fungus that can grow in your mucous membranes. It can be extremely dangerous because it grows very quickly. So it sometimes requires amputation to remove the area that's infected with mucor. Although it's fairly rare unless you are immunocompromised. So people don't typically get really bad mucor infections. You guys may have heard of like if you get like black fungus in your house, you know, like growing in like moist areas or whatever, it's pretty bad. So often that black fungus can produce like a lot of really toxic compounds. So you probably want to prevent significant fungus from growing in your house. If you have a lot of fungus, you can get your house condemned because it's extremely difficult to remove once you have like large bodies of fungus growing in your house. The spores get everywhere. They start growing like in little corners all over your house, and they can produce a lot of toxic compounds. So if you've ever had fungus abrogation in your house where people come in to remove it, they're all wearing like space suits, and they come in and they like cordon off part of your house and remove parts of your wall or whatever and like try and get rid of everything. It's quite difficult to get rid of fungus once it grows. So you always got to keep that moisture level in your house down. Use your bathroom fan. Anyway, there are pathogenic fungus there's a lot of pathogenic fungus in the animal world as well. Oh, did I cut out here, Angela? Sorry. What it said after European truffle. My bad. Let me zoom in for you. All it says is how much they cost. That's that number was taken from last year. I looked up like market price for European truffles. I don't know if that's changed since then. I don't know. I wonder if people are loading up on truffles during lockdown or something. I have no idea. I can't buy my favorite breakfast cereal, so I don't know if European truffles are still available. And also, guys, what is up with people buying toilet paper again? Give me a break. It was sold out the other day when I went to the grocery store. Come on. There's no run on toilet paper. Relax. I know it's not you, but like, geez. I thought we learned something from the last time.
It's not like the symptoms are diarrhea.
No, exactly. Like you know, you're not gonna all of a sudden start be like blowing through toilet paper. The people that bought like 5,000 rolls of toilet paper like 6 months ago, did you really use it? And if you did, go see a doctor, okay? That's not normal. That's a lot.
It was like they came home with like a billion packages of it. We saw them bringing them out of their car. Their trunk was full with it. So
It's like the toilet paper supply chain is very stable. There's no reason to suspect that we're running out. There's no run on it. Like, I don't get it. That's the one thing that people are like, oh, toilet paper. I'm gonna make sure we get millions of this. I guess, but even then, there was like very, very little supply chain disruption last time. It's like there's really no need for that. Anyway. So, sorry, hopefully you got that. No worries. You guys heard of white nose syndrome before? So it's a fungal infection that affects bats, and it's devastating. So what it does is it basically makes bats get an itchy nose, which doesn't sound very severe. But when they hibernate over the winter, they keep waking up out of their hibernation to itch their nose, which it sounds so innocent, but they end up using so much energy coming out of hibernation again and again to itch their nose that they die during the winter, which is really sad. So it's like decimating bat populations. We have a huge problem with this, and bats are super important population regulators for things like mosquitoes. I mean, they have a very important ecological niche. So this is quite concerning. It's possible that humans are responsible for a lot of the spread of this as well, because people go like cave diving and things like that, and they end up taking the spores from one cave to another cave, like on their shoes. If you go and visit a national park in the US, which I did a couple years ago, what they do now is before you go in to the cave, they like chemically disinfect your shoes. You have to like go through this like chemical disinfectant station, and then when you leave the cave, they do it again in an effort to prevent the spread of white nose syndrome, but I don't think it's working very well. So hopefully bats are able to evolve past this. I think they're looking for other strategies to help bats, perhaps either genetically engineering some members of the species that have a gene that protects them from white nose syndrome, or potentially using some other method to stabilize the bat population. But this is a huge, huge problem. I don't really know currently what the status of this is. Is there a good treatment for white nose syndrome? Do we have a strategy for actually eliminating it? So I'm going to get you guys to look into that. I don't know the answer to this. So I'm hoping that there's been some recent update. I added this in here because I'm curious. You guys should investigate that too. So what is the current strategy regarding white nose syndrome? What's the status in Canada? Do we have a big problem with it here? I know in the US that they do. Okay, and then the last component of this is I'm going to get you to answer these 3 questions from the text. Please note that these are not the original questions that were posted. I looked back at those questions and I was like, oh, we don't really cover that anymore. We've kind of changed what we do. So do these ones instead. Okay, these are a little bit more related to what we currently do in this unit. I'm going to give you guys maybe like the next 20 minutes. What parts were there here? So there's this part, question 3. Do a little research into how fermentation is used to make things. And then the white nose syndrome part and these questions from the text. Okay, let's say 20 minutes. So that would put us at 9:40, 9:50. Okay, let's get back into it. Any questions from the questions that you were working on? Something you didn't understand? Nope. Okay. All right. Let's pick up where we left off then. So the second topic that we're going to talk about today is plants. Like I said, we're going to do a whole unit on plants, so we're really going to dig into this stuff in like hyper detail later on. Oh, how does the reproduction work with plants? We'll talk about a whole bunch of different strategies. What are the different parts of a plant? Biochemically, how are they arranged? What are the structures of the stem? What are the structures of the leaf, et cetera, et cetera. So we'll get into real good detail on that later. So this is just a broad overview of plants in general, not specifics really. So they're all multicellular and all eukaryotic. I don't use the word all a lot, but these ones really are all multicellular and all eukaryotic. There's no single-celled plants. So if you see something that looks like a plant, but it's single-celled, it's a protist. So these ones are all multicellular. They probably have protists as an ancestor, certainly genetically. If you look at their relatedness to plant-like protists, they have obviously a lot of overlap in terms of their genome. So they probably did evolve from plant-like protists at some point. Somewhere around 400 million years ago, which we're going to talk about in a sec. And in general, they form the bottom of every food web, except for aquatic ones. So aquatic ones, typically protists and bacteria make up the bottom of the food web. but all terrestrial ones certainly are supported by plants. There are 4 main phylums. So if you remember back from the levels of taxonomy, okay, those are the ranks, taxonomic ranks. It goes kingdom, and then phylum is the next one below kingdom. Okay, so these of the kingdom Plantae, these are the subgroups of kingdom Plantae. There are 4 main ones. So bryophytes is one of them. Bryophytes are non-vascular plants. So those are plants that don't have xylem and phloem, which are like plant veins, basically. If you've ever looked at a plant leaf, I want to just grab them. We had to take all the plants out of here. But when we had plants in here at one point, if you just look at a leaf, you can see the veins on the leaf, right? I'll show you a picture. I have a feeling you know what I'm talking about already, but oil price. Leaf veins. These. So this is vascularization. It is a system to transport stuff around the plant. Send sugar away, bring water up, whatever, okay? So vascular plants have some kind of vein system that transports, or vascular system to transport stuff around it. Bryophytes don't. So typically those are things like mosses. Mosses don't have any type of transport system in them. So that's like the earliest plant from an evolutionary perspective. We'll talk about that in a second. Pteridophytes do have vascularization. So they have a simple system for transporting stuff around, but they don't have seeds of any kind. So those are things like ferns. Ferns are pteridophytes. Vascularization, but ferns don't make seeds. They have this like weird system where they drop haploid things. They're kind of like spores, actually. And then their spores make contact, and then they form the diploid organism. But there's no seeds involved in that reproductive strategy. So those are, again, very early plants. Gymnosperms are plants that have cones. So they don't have true seeds that they produce. They're sort of like semi-seeds. They don't have a coating on the outside of their seed. And they also are not fertilized by insects or some kind of secondary animal. They're wind fertilized. In other words, they throw their pollen up into the air and hope for the best. They just hope it lands on a mate. And angiosperms are the most common type of plant and also the most recent from an evolutionary perspective, and those are flowering plants. So an angiosperm is a plant that makes flowers. And they make up by far the most plants because it's a really good reproductive strategy, but they do need insects. So what's true about all of these different things? Well, they all do photosynthesis, so they're all autotrophs. They're all sessile, so you're not going to see plants walking or moving to a new location. They definitely root themselves for their entire life cycle. Other than, okay, I guess that's not entirely true. During alternation of generations, their seeds are not rooted, but they're not motile, so you don't see the seeds walking or anything. They're all, like I said, they're all multicellular, and they have cellulose on a biochemical level. They all have cellulose in their cell membranes. That's the part that you can't digest. We'll come back to this when we talk about the digestive system, but you have no way to digest cellulose, which means that all the cellulose that you do eat is dietary fiber, which helps keep your digestive system moving. You need to consume cellulose. Okay, so where did these plants come from? As I mentioned, they probably come from multicellular protists. So those multicellular protists are a class of protists called charophytes. So if we look at the phylogeny here, somewhere around 600 million years ago, somewhere in here, there we get a departure where modern charophytes, which are, like I said, multicellular protists, branch off from green algae. Okay, so green algae is single-celled protists. So we have an evolution to multi-celled protists, plant-like protists, and another branch that can survive on land. That's a pretty big adaptation for plants. So we're seeing the first movement for plant-like things moving onto land from water, okay? And the very simplest of those was the bryophytes. So they were the earliest to evolve somewhere around 400, 450 million years ago. That's what the fossil record shows. So that's when these land plants start showing up on land, somewhere around 450 million years ago. And that includes things like liverwort, hornworts, and various types of mosses. I'm sure you guys have seen moss before. But I'll bring up a picture just anyway. So here's some lovely mosses. They're so soft when you touch them. So this is a plant. You won't really see a lot of tall mosses, so they don't get that high off the ground. And the reason why they don't get that high is because they don't have vascularization. So they have no way to pump water very far off the surface. So you have to keep all your cells fairly close to the water, which is near the bottom. They can transport water inside, but they literally have to transport it one cell to the other. So cells like here, take this water, and then they pass it on to the next cell, and they pass it on to the next cell. It's a terrible way to transport water. So you can't get really big plants like this growing because there's no way to transport it. Hi.
Morning, how are you?
I'm well, thank you. How are you guys?
Well, can I steal 5 minutes?
Absolutely. Okay. Take a pause, guys at home. Do you want to be on camera here for a
Yeah,
minute
they've
too?
already heard me. You can tell them to go get a coffee or something.
All right, sure.
Morning, everyone. How's everyone today? Good, thank you. I'm Mr. Haight. I'm your principal. We're joined by one of your vice principals, Miss Fairhall back there. Sorry to interrupt. I'm going to steal 5 to 7 minutes. What we decided to do this year is, starting last week, we went into all our classrooms with the last cohort, and we're continuing this week to do this cohort. We're going in to see all of our students, really to say, welcome back. We missed you. It's been 6 months since we had KCI students in our building, and we love having KCI students in our building, so thank you for being here. We appreciate it so much. Now, as I say that, it's different. We have our PPE on, the hallways look different, the stairways look different. Our doorways are different. We have some different rules and guidelines that we have to follow. And with that, you may have some questions. So we're going to be here to answer those questions. If I summarize all the information, here's the basics. Everything we're doing in school is to try and keep you safe. We have 2 modes of thinking. Mode 1, try and keep COVID-19 out of KCI. Mode 2, if it happens to get into KCI, try to minimize the spread of it. That's the basics of everything we're doing. That's what we're trying to accomplish. Any questions? Mr. Wiegelman answered all of your questions for you? Really?
We spent some time on day one talking
Really?
about it.
That's awesome.
Hopefully.
Okay. If you have questions at any other time, feel free to ask your teacher. And if Mr. Wiegelman doesn't know the answers, he'll ask us and we'll try and get you those answers. We're here to try and support you and try to make sure you feel good about being here at KCI. The second part of why we're coming into the classes is to remind everyone we're part of a community. We're part of the same team. And we have an individual role to play for ourselves, but we also have a role to play to try and help our neighbors. Sometimes you feel isolated, but let's make the most of this situation. I do have an ask. So I notice in the mornings, outside in the busing areas, as the bus students get off and are waiting to get in the building, and we have some walkers that are waiting to get in the building, we have a pretty big congestion of students that are together. So if you're caught in that, part 1 of that is stay 2 meters away from your neighbors. But part 2 of that is pick a different door to come in. We've opened up all of our doors in the morning. You don't have to all wait at the same door. You can pick a different door and spread out. So if you're coming to this class, you could walk around the school when it's nice and come into that door or this door. And it helps you just to not have congestion. All right? So following the line of community and team, what we are doing is, as a symbol of that, we are giving t-shirts away to all of our students and all of our staff to remind everyone we're in this together and we're going to make the most of it. So we're going to call 2 students out in the hall, get your t-shirts. They'll come out when they come back in. The next 2 students go, the next 2 students go. All right? So let's start with you in the back. You head out there and get your t-shirts.
Cool. I'm just going to give them a second to do their t-shirt distribution so people don't miss stuff since they're going in and out. So just chill for 1 second, guys. Did you guys go on this side already? No, you did. All right. You guys could probably go, eh? Yeah. Did you go already? No, you go. Go ahead. Go ahead.
Are we down to the last three?
Yeah, last three. Yeah.
Okay, big group.
Come on, guys. Oh, I'm about to run out of time here before the break. No problem. We're on track. We're on track. So I mentioned mosses fit into that category. The other two are probably not as common in this climate zone, which are liverworts. Liverwort looks like this. We do have these here, but they're just not as common as mosses are. And hornworts are also part of this category. So again, they're usually low-lying.
Get one.
This is a hornwort.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
No worries. Thank you. Yeah, like so they're pretty low lying because they don't have vascularization, so they can't grow very high off the surface of the ground, which is a pretty big restriction for a plant, which are usually competing for sunlight. And we'll come back we normally take our walk 11:05, 11:13, I think is when we come back. So I'll see you guys then. Cheers. All right, for those of you at home, just let me know if you're here still. I gotta take attendance. If you are here. Is anybody here? Oh yeah, everyone's here. Awesome. Oh, you guys are so good. Everybody's here on time. Amazing. Perfect. No, we didn't lose anyone in here? No, we didn't. Okay. So we left off, we were talking about the phylums, the plant phylums. So, by the way, the first one on this list, these Cherophyceans, these are actually they're not plants. So these are protists. So, a little bit confusing that it's on this table here, but these are sort of like the precursors to plants. Not a plant, so don't need to worry about that one. Bryophytes, like I said, are like liverworts, mosses. Pteridophytes have vascularization, so they have those little veins, but they don't have seeds. Gymnosperms and angiosperms both have seeds, but gymnosperms are slightly earlier split than flowering plants. They split off about 150 million years ago from flowering plants, which are the most modern iteration of plants, which are the angiosperms, which require fertilization by insects. So that's kind of summarized at the top here. These are all the land plants, which are all the plants. These ones are vascular, and then these ones have seeds. So then that also goes sort of in the order of their evolution. The reason that we think that they're linked to these cherophytes, as I mentioned, was a number of things, but they have the same photopigment, which is chlorophyll. So it's actually biochemically identical. And the chances of chlorophyll evolving separately, completely independently, is very unlikely. It's a complex molecule. So the photopigment is the same, which suggests that they were definitely had a common ancestry. And they also produce starches as their product of photosynthesis. So we talked about how some bacteria do something similar to photosynthesis, and we also talked about how some protists do photosynthesis, but for the most part they don't make starch. So they do make a multi-carbon energy structure, but it's not formed into starch and stored as starch in the organism. And charophyceans, or charophytes, do store their sugar as starch, and so do plants. So again, that's like a big connection between the two. They seem to have a lot of overlap genetically as well, which is why we think that they're related. So the life cycle of plants, we talked about the life cycle for fungus, but the one for plants is called alternation of generations. So you can see that it's fairly different than the life cycle for fungus, in that you don't get those 1N spores that like have to grow into each other in order to form a 2N adult. So for plants, they always have what's called a sporophyte generation. So the sporophyte, and obviously we'll come back to this in the plant unit, but the sporophyte is the adult plant, the one that has the full genetic complement, the 2N complement. And grown-up plants, sporophytes, produce what are called gametophytes. Gametophytes are the pollen and the egg component. So male reproductive structures will produce pollen, or depending on the type of plant, in ferns and things like that, they're called spores, but it's very similar to pollen in that it's 1N. And then there's a female gametophyte component as well that's also 1N. The two 1N components meet, usually within one of the plants, although with ferns, they do actually meet outside of the plant. So with ferns, it's actually more similar to fungus. They meet outside the plant, they fertilize, come together to form a 2N structure, a zygote, that is, which grows into a grown-up sporophyte, which creates more gametophytes, and then they keep alternating between those two. That's why it's called alternation of generations. So every one of these plants from over here, all the land plants anyway, these guys, they all have that reproductive strategy. There's minor modifications to them depending on the phylum that you're looking at, but it's essentially the same thing, no matter what you look at. We'll come back to that. But it's a fairly straightforward life cycle. Okay, in a minute, on your own here, I'm going to get you to read these two. Whoa. Do you really need to read all that? Let me double check. I don't think you do, actually. That seems like a lot. I don't remember the reading being that long. For those of you at home, sorry about the scans on the textbooks. They're not fantastic. I did my best, but I don't have access to the documents for these ones. So it would have been 90, what does it say, 89? Oh, I guess you do. It's a lot of diagrams. So I would say about half of that page space is actually diagrams, but it gives you a brief overview of each of the four. So what you're looking for when you go through and read this are just a few unique characteristics of each. We actually mentioned some of them already, like the big things that differentiate them from the other groups. But that's all you need. So you only need like one or two major things. Like if you were looking at a bunch of plants, you'd be like, oh, well, that has this. That's a bryophyte. Or, oh, that has this on it. It has a flower. That's angiosperm. Okay? So you're just looking to pick out one or two, like the major things that separate these out from the other groups. Okay, and then you're going to do questions 2 and 3 from the text. I was really hoping to get this done before the break, but yeah, and then that's one of the questions. We can take that up later if we want to. I think I'm going to give you time to do it right now. And then why don't I come back and like, realistically, how long is this going to take? Half an hour? The reading is the longest part. Why don't you try doing this and the questions, and then doing the watch the video as well. So the video is posted on here. It's also a summary of the different plant groups. And you know what you could try, if you want to skip the reading, you could just watch the video and see if you can pick up the major, because I believe it talks about the 4 as well in the video. So if you can pick up the major stuff from the video, you might be able to skip the reading. So it's right here. That's the video. Okay, give that a shot. Maybe 25 minutes, we'll come back. Leave the window open in case we do it a little bit earlier. I'm gonna keep track of where people are at here in the room. And if you are done early, consider working on the checkpoint quiz, the first checkpoint quiz. Test it out. All right, let's pick back up here. I realize that not everyone necessarily had time to finish. You can use your time during learning block 3 to finish off any of that stuff. So the last thing that we're going to talk about today are animals. For this one, we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about the groups and the phylogenetic tree for animals, like the phylums. Question?
I just have a question real quick. I was watching the amoeba video. How wide are they?
For which one, sorry?
I was watching the amoeba video.
Mhm.
Like, how wide are they? 'Cause, like, they look flat, but are they?
Like, do they have any depth to them?
Yeah.
They're like roughly cylindrical.
Oh.
Yeah. So they're absolutely, they're 3-dimensional. So they blob around stuff like this. A lot of the times in those videos, there's a slide cover sitting on top, and so it's actually squishing them flat. So when you see them like enveloping something, they're only enveloping it in 2 dimensions because there's a glass slide cover pressing down on them. But if you were to take that glass slide cover off, they do envelop things in 3 dimensions. Like it's a 3-dimensional organism. I get what you mean though. It does look 2D. Yeah. Sorry. So we're gonna spend a little bit more time talking about this because in the animals unit, we mostly focus, like I said, on the systems of animals. We're gonna talk about respiratory, digestive, and circulatory system in a lot of detail, but we don't really get into like the phylogeny of animals. Like that's kind of a little bit beyond the scope of the animal unit. So we'll talk about that stuff right here. So I think this is the one people are the most familiar with. So I probably don't have to harp on this too much. All animals are multicellular, as you're probably already aware. They're all heterotrophs. They all have to eat things. So there's no photosynthetic animals, at least that we know of. I suppose it could exist, but we don't have any knowledge of that. If you see something that looks like an animal, but it is photosynthetic, it's probably a protist, and it's probably single-celled. So they're eukaryotes, just like you. You're an animal. You're eukaryotic. There is a lot of different behavioral and reproductive strategies for animals. So you can't really break them down and be like, they all look like this. Some of them reproduce sexually. Some of them reproduce asexually through like a cloning process. They're all motile for at least part of their life cycle. So that's one of the key things that is true for all animals. They do move around, at least for part. The sponges would be the weirdest one, where they only move around for like the very beginning of their life cycle, and then they anchor somewhere, and then they never move again. But other than sponges, most of them are motile for their entire life cycle. So some have nerves to coordinate movement. I think that's a little bit too much of a definitive statement. A lot of them have this. The sponges are an exception again. They don't have true tissue, so they don't have a nervous system. Some of them have nerves to coordinate movement, but they don't have a central nervous system, like jellyfish, like cnidarians. So they may have nerves, but they don't have like a central coordination of those nerves. And then once we get through the groups, you'll see that certain groups have other evolved characteristics like bones or a bony skeleton. Some of them have pairs of limbs. Some of them have waterproof skin, which is essential if the animal is going to not live in the water, because you got to keep the water in for the most part if you live on land. And then they have various reproductive strategies, amniotic eggs, which is one of the strategies that vertebrates can use to live on land. So if you don't want your offspring to dry out, you got to keep them inside until they're fully developed, and then you can release them. A lot of animals that haven't evolved that have to lay their eggs in water in order to prevent them from being dried out. Most of us have 3 germ layers. By most of us, I mean most animals. All humans do. The endoderm, the mesoderm, and the ectoderm. We talked about this previously, I think very, very briefly, this idea of like layers that exist when you're an embryo developing, and like the internal ones, the internal layer becomes like your central nervous system, your digestive system. The middle one becomes your organs, your other organs, internal organs, and then the outer one, the ectoderm, becomes your skin and like your outer covering and the fascia and stuff like that around the outside of your body. So there's a layering system that exists in animals. This is obviously quite complex. So you don't see this in the other groups. Plants don't have that. They don't have separate germ layers. It's one single germ layer. Protists, even multicelled protists, don't have germ layers. So this is like something exclusive to animals. All kinds of complexity levels here, which we're going to go through. The simplest ones are the sea sponges and the jellyfish. And then you get super complex ones like mammals, all the chordates. Most of them are protostomes. We're going to talk about that in a second. And chordates are the most complex. I don't need you to know all of these groupings. So with the plants, there aren't that many of them. There's only really these 4 main groupings of plants. So it would be good for you to know the properties of the 4 main groups of plants and what they're called. But for animals, it's a real dog's breakfast here. There's a lot of stuff going on. That's a lot of groups for you to know. You don't need to know that for this course. Maybe if you take a zoology course, you probably will have to know that, but not for this course. So in general, if you have a good feel for the general trends that exist in the animal kingdom, for example, like what's the simplest and earliest evolved animal, what's the most complex animal and most recently evolved, and what are some of the differences between the groups, that would be a good thing for you to know. But what the names are of every single group, every single phylum of animal is not necessary for you to know that. That's too much information. But you should know the properties of animals, what we all share. Okay, so for eukaryotes, we talked about all this, blah, blah, blah. Surprisingly, most animals are water-bound. So the majority of animals actually live in water. I guess that makes sense. That's the place where we all evolved out of. And so still the majority of them remain there in terms of number of species. Of those, most of them are saltwater, which also makes sense. It's probably the original location of animal evolution. And then fewer of them are in freshwater, and still fewer live on land. So there's sort of like a hierarchy there. The highest numbers in saltwater, then freshwater, and then land-based animals are actually the most rare of all animals, but they happen to be the ones that we have the most experience with because we live on land. We talked about them, they're all motile. And the ones that are sessile is the opposite of motile, by the way. It means you're stuck in one spot, are only sessile as adults. So they are all motile at some point. These are great words for your vocabulary list, by the way. Okay, so what are the general ways then that we group these? It happens to coincide really well with phylogeny. This is not a phylogenetic tree. It's not a cladogram because it does not include a timeline, but it is based on genetic relatedness as well. So it's structural, but the structures are related to genetics, so it happens to coincide with those things. So the first major change, by the way, these are all animals. Okay, so these are all the animal groups right here, all the phyla. The first major difference between animal groups is nerves. So it's the development of true tissues, nervous tissue, muscle tissue, but nerves is the big one separating. So if you look at the periphery over here, which are sea sponges, and a couple other species related closely to sea sponges, they don't have nerves, okay? They just have sponge. Sponge goes all the way through, from the outside to the inside. There's no difference. No matter where you stop, if you cut a sea sponge in half, it looks the same all the way through. You don't find like the middle part of the sea sponge or the whatever. It's just a sea sponge. So, have you guys ever seen these before? I should put up some videos of these so you can see them. They're pretty cool. Maybe I'll throw some in the stuff at the bottom. So that's the first major division in animals. Are sea sponges animals? Yes, we call them animals, but they're kind of like just barely animals. Like I said, they don't really have true tissues. They are stationary for almost their entire life cycle. They're heterotrophs. They eat stuff. They're multicellular. They're kind of like a multicellular animal-like protist. So they're right on the border there between being a protist and being an animal. This is where we draw the line. Okay, so we call this one the first one that falls into the animal group. But we share a lot of genetics with sea sponges, oddly enough, mostly biochemical similarities in our genetics. So they're definitely like evolutionarily related. So of the ones with nerves, so now we're talking about all the rest of these groups, they all have nerves in some form. The next major split is in the type of symmetry that exists. So I think we talked about this previously just briefly, but these guys have this radial symmetry where all of their body sections are symmetrical but in a circle around a center point. That's radial symmetry. Cnidarians, which include jellyfish, have that. And then all of the rest of the groups have bilateral symmetry. So that split occurred quite long ago from an evolutionary perspective. Question?
Does everything have to fit into a category, or can stuff just be like stuff? Like, is there like an animal that's just like its own thing?
We created these categories as a method of classifying organisms. We chose them.
Yeah, but like, is there stuff that's just isn't part of the category that we made?
Well, I mean, there's all of these categories have in-groups and out-groups, right? Things that fit the category and things that don't. And they're selected based on when those things evolved. So the earliest evolved category that we found is the development of nerves. Some things in the animal kingdom don't have them, and some things do. And so that development, when nerves first showed up, was very early in animal evolution. So most animals do have it, but then a few don't. We picked these. So we can choose whatever we want for these categories to be, but we're trying to pick things to help organize them. It's an organization system that we decide. It's like you have a bunch of clothes sitting on a bed and you want to like organize them in your closet. You can pick how you want to do that. Do you want to do them by color? Do you want to organize them by like the date they were manufactured? Do you want to organize them by like their like style or whatever? Like you choose. And like this is the system that we chose, and it's based on timeline. So symmetry is like the next thing we've chosen as a good way to split these up. Most things are bilaterally symmetrical, as you can see from here. So of the bilaterally symmetrical ones, the next major split is between the protostomes and the deuterostomes. So a protostome, do I have this label here somewhere? Oh, maybe I don't. Oh yeah, I do. It's over here, good. So a protostome forms the mouth first. So that's an embryological development. Two of the big things that form first in embryological development is the neural tube. So it's a single nerve that goes usually from the top to the bottom of the embryo, and the digestive tract. So those are like the first things that form in an embryo. If you do like a very, very early scan of like a baby, or you could look at an embryo of any animal, you see the same basic structures in every animal embryo, pretty much, not including sea sponges. You see the formation of a neural tube and the formation of a digestive tract. So protostomes get that mouth first development. It starts at the mouth and then the tube builds to the end. that happens to be the older version, okay? That's like digestive system 1.0, okay? Then a little bit later in evolution, animals started to evolve to be deuterostomes, and a deuterostome is when the development starts from the anus and goes up to the mouth. The interesting thing about protostomes is that you don't necessarily have to have the digestive tract go all the way through. So some of them, the digestive tract starts at the mouth and makes it about halfway, and then it's just like, good enough. That works. So some animals do that. Perfect example are these flatworms, the platyhelminths. Platyhelminths have a mouth and a digestive tract, but then it just like ends. So they like take food in, they absorb the good stuff, and then they just bleh, they just like send back out the stuff that they don't want. That works. You can do that. It's not a great system. So I mean, like most organisms after that evolved like different mechanisms that were more efficient, but it absolutely works. So if you're a protostome, you may not even have the full tube, but deuterostomes all have the full tube. So they go bottom up. Surprisingly, the echidnoderms, things like starfish, actually have very complex systems. They have a complex digestive system. They have a complex nervous system. They don't necessarily have higher intelligence, but they do have very complex body systems, and they are the most closely related of all of the other animal groups to humans, which is very unusual. But so you wouldn't guess that necessarily from looking at them, but they are pretty complex biochemically as well. And then some of the other main differentiations here are the number of germ layers. Those that split is actually right here. It's not included on here, but number of germ layers 2, and then here number of germ layers 2+, depending on what you're looking at in the chordates. You don't really need to know that. That's not a huge deal. But so these are just some basic ways to classify these organisms. Okay, so as they become more complex, further along in the evolutionary process, they're gaining nerves, bilateral symmetry, and then a change in how their digestive system is structured. Okay, and then eventually more germ layers in that order. Okay, so we kind of think of these as the 4 significant evolutionary differences, okay, between the earliest animals and the most recently evolved animals. And then, of course, there are more of these. So if you look within the nematodes, you can split them and split them and split them and split them based on genetic differences. And you can do that in every one of these groups, okay? But these are just the phylums. So this is how they're split down into phylums, and then kingdom, phylum, class would be the next one, right? So each of these phylums is split into different classes based on characteristics. Each of those classes is based on, or is broken down into orders, different orders, okay? And on and on and on, all the way down to species. Any questions about that? That's like the basic system of organization for animals. What we're going to do in this course is mostly talk about chordates, because you're a chordate, and most of the animals that you interact with are chordates, although, I mean, you have interactions with arthropods and other things as well, but we seem to be so focused on ourselves. Humans are very self-focused. All right, let's keep going. I'm not really sure what goes under here. I probably had an interesting note down there and then I forgot. Oh well. Let's talk about chordates. So again, they are the most recently evolved. I should mention, by the way, that there's no such thing as more evolved. There's no more evolved or less evolved. It's not like a competition. It's not a judgment. So like the things over here, the sea sponges have been evolving just as long as we have. They just evolved different structures, not ours, okay? So there's not really such thing as being more evolved, but there are more structures that have evolved. So they could be more complex, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're more evolved. All right, chordates. Most of them are vertebrates, like you. So a vertebrate is a chordate, something that has a spinal cord and has a backbone, a bone around the cord. Almost all chordates are vertebrates, but not all of them. So some chordates are not vertebrates. Of all the animals, almost every single one is an invertebrate. In other words, it doesn't have a backbone. So if you look back at this grouping here, everything except for a few chordates are invertebrates. So all of these things over here you would consider to be invertebrates. That's, the vast majority of animal species. So vertebrates are definitely the most common. I'm going to actually cross something out here. Not all corals are animals. Some of them are. Some of them are like protist plant hybrids, depending on the type of coral. Let's just not confuse that. I'm not going to put that in there. Some of them are animals. I wish there was an easier way for me to show videos on here. If I try and open YouTube with this thing, it crashes. Otherwise, I would just show you the videos, but I'm just posting them instead. I think it's probably better for everybody. We don't need any more technical problems. Can I keep going here? You guys okay? So what I'm going to get you guys to do is get a little bit more information about the classes of vertebrates. These ones we're going to focus on a little bit more, again, because you're a vertebrate. And this is a little bit more applicable to, the species that you're running into on a fairly regular basis here. Vertebrate animals. It's a fairly small group. The ones you're probably most familiar with are the ones that are the most recently evolved ones. Some of these are actually extinct. This one only has a couple left. Agnathans used to be extremely common, jawless fish, but now I think there's only a few species of jawless fish that are left. Cartilaginous fish. Oh, that would be like sharks. Bony fish, amphibians. Yeah, so these probably are the ones that you're the most familiar with. Amphibians, reptiles, aves or birds, and mammals. But I'd like you to find an example of each, to find a couple examples. See if you can find the scientific name for each of your examples. You want specific species here. Even better if you can find a North American example. One that lives in Canada would even be preferable. And then a couple features of these. So what makes something a jawless fish? What is an agnathan? How do you know you're looking at a bird? Something from class aves. And then lastly, how many species are there in this grouping? So in other words, like how common are they? So if you you can find that information in the textbook. It's basically taken straight out of your text on page 104 and 105. If you're at home, it should be in that PDF document that's linked under the day. Heads up to you guys, this stuff on this stuff right here, which is about sort of the evolution of eukaryotes. We're actually going to skip that. We don't have time to cover that anymore. That was sort of just like a little extra thing that we did previously. So these last couple pages you don't need to worry about. We're not going to cover these. I had to cut it because we're getting pretty much to the limit of what we can cover in this time. But I do have some analysis questions. Please note I crossed off one in the middle. Which one did I cross off? Yeah, number 7. Number 7 is like a really verbose research question that I absolutely don't need you to do. Okay, so don't worry about that one. But these other ones here are really relevant to what we're talking about. So try these. Let me know if you have any questions. One last thing I wanted to mention was I put up a summary chart. I think I put it in learning block 3. Yeah. It says consider completing this summary sheet. If you can't see that, the reason you can't see it is because I updated it at some point today and added it in. So you just need to reload the page. But it is a summary sheet of all of the kingdoms. So I put a blank one up there for you. The idea is that you can use it as part of your review. So go through the sheet and just, okay, archaea, what kind of cells do they have? Are they multicelled or unicelled? Do they have mitochondria? Do they have chloroplasts? How do they get their nutrients? How do they reproduce generally? Where do you find them? Anything else interesting about them that you know? What's an example? Okay, you can put classes in there, they don't have to be specific species. But try using this as a review. I've posted this completed one right below it. Okay, so if you're like going through and you're like, I actually don't know, like based on what I have in my notes, like I don't know if they have mitochondria or whatever. I posted a completed version right under it where it says there's a completed version here. So you can take a look at that. I highly recommend that you know these groups. The unit quiz is kind of making the assumption that you're fairly familiar with the groups, and that if you had some examples of these in front of you, you could say, oh, that's definitely from this kingdom. I know the properties of that. This is a protist, okay, or whatever. So just as a heads up there, it's a pretty good sheet to use as part of your study. And once you're done all that, please consider trying checkpoint quiz 2, which is off there on the side, okay? Hopefully at that point, if you've reviewed your notes, you've tried the practice quizzes, you aced them, or maybe not, and then you went back and had a second look at some things. You did the review summary sheet of the kingdoms, you're probably okay for the quiz, okay? That's what I'm hoping anyway. So we're gonna write that tomorrow, probably in learning block 3, and you can write it anytime before midnight. And the first learning block tomorrow, we're gonna be working on our summative project from the unit, and we'll decide on a timeline for that together, okay? But we'll try and keep it reasonable. It's not super onerous. Does anybody have any questions about what you're supposed to be working on, like what you're doing? Fairly straightforward. Okay, if you have questions at home, or if you guys have questions, feel free to ask.